All right, so we might as well do this. So the reason you're all here, kind of, the Ukraine story, right? So you've heard about the invasion of Ukraine. Before I go any further, I wholly condemn the invasion of Ukraine by the Russian state. That is totally unjustified, regardless of what they're saying. All war is unjustified. Even defensive war requires an aggressor, making the war unjustified at its core. So, truthfully, all war is unjustified. I absolutely condemn everything the Russian state has done. This conflict is going to create untold numbers of refugees, dead and wounded. Um, Conventional wars don't really work in a modern sense. Military and civilian are very much tied up, and it's hard to avoid civilian casualties, even if that was the goal. It's almost impossible in a modern setting where there aren't open field battles to avoid civilian casualties, to avoid civilian fatalities, to avoid putting people in harm's way who don't deserve to be there, who are innocent, who have nothing to do with the conflict. So absolutely condemn that in every way. So unfortunately, I kind of feel like I called this a bunch of weeks ago when I started talking about Beijing Games and how escalations between the US and Russia were going to lead to conflict. Now, true, there hasn't been a conflict directly between the United States and the Russian Federation. Thank God. May we not have a World War III scenario breaking out. That would be great. But truthfully, we were on a path to war very early. Now, I want to take some time today to talk a little bit about the players in the game, the contexts, and some more of what's going on that I haven't heard a ton covered by mainstream and even some independent sources. So I wanted to take some time to go through these things. And by the way, nothing I say here is taking a side except for the side of there should not be war, right? I'm a peacenik through and through. I don't think any war is justified, as I said earlier, but I do want to give some context, and then you can use that context however you see fit, right? So let's start with Ukraine. Who is Ukraine? What is Ukraine? So obviously Ukraine is an Eastern European country. It would be celebrating about its 20-year birthday fairly soon. As far as a modern independent state goes, Ukraine is a baby on the world stage. It has only really been around as an independent nation since 1992 when the Soviet Union collapsed. Before that, the land that we now know as Ukraine was the Ukraine SSR, which was a member state of the Soviet Union, wasn't an independent state. Before that, the Ukraine was a portion of the Pale of Settlement region of the Russian Empire. Before that, into the 1700s, the land that we now call Ukraine was part of the Poland-Lithuanian Empire. And before that, there aren't really records of a holistic Ukrainian state. There have always been people there. There have been people living in that area for a very, very long time. And they have bonds that they can trace back all the way to the foundation of the Kievan Rus, which was a small microstate in Europe in the pre-medieval times. I'm forgetting exactly the dates. I apologize. I think it's 900 AD-ish. Was founded then, and Kievan Rus became Ukraine adjacent for pretty much all of history. So people who call themselves Ukrainians, they trace their legacy and roots back to the Kievan Rus, who were an offshoot of the Muscovian Rus, who ultimately became Russia. But again, this has no bearing on Ukraine today, other than to provide its history. But the independent nation of Ukraine that we all know today, and hopefully continue to know for much longer, is a creation, as it were, of the collapse of the Soviet Union. Okay, and look, regardless of what you think about the longevity of Ukraine as a country or what have you, one of the things that we believe strongly on the left is self-determinism, right? The importance of people being able to choose their own destinies. So even if Ukraine was 2 months old as opposed to 20 years old, if that's who they wanted to be, let them be that, right? So all good there. Now, let's address some of what was going on in Ukraine before this started happening, right? So Ukraine wants to be a part of NATO. Ukraine has wanted to be a part of NATO for a while now, but there has been conflict in Ukraine as far as what side of the Russia v. NATO side of this that Ukraine has been on. The current president, Volodymyr Zelensky, came after Petroshenko, I think was the gentleman's name before him, who was pro-Russian and was thought to have ties to the Kremlin when he was running Ukraine. And so there has been this kind of back and forth now between what side of this divide in Europe that the Ukrainian government has kind of been on. But recent polls show that the people now are very interested in joining NATO. Of course, NATO is problematic for a number of reasons, and I've addressed them on previous shows. But essentially, the long story short is it is a quote unquote defensive military alliance that has had their guns pointed at Russia / the Soviet Union since the 40s. It's a relic of the Cold War. It doesn't really need to exist any longer. Its purpose is expired. The Soviet Union doesn't exist. So honestly, my assessment is we should just break up NATO. That way it's not an issue at all. But, I digress. But at the end of the day, regardless of what side of that divide that Ukraine found itself on 3 days ago when it got invaded by the Russian state, it doesn't matter because Ukraine is innocent in all this, in the sense that Ukraine was not trying to go to war with Russia, and Ukraine was not trying to actively antagonize the Russian state militarily. Okay, Ukraine was just doing its own thing, and a lot of this is happening to Ukraine because of where it sits, and so on and so forth. So that's Ukraine. Let's move over to the NATO side here. So as I mentioned, NATO was founded in the aftermath of World War II. It was an amalgam of capitalist US-aligned states who were frustrated at the power of the Soviet Union and wanted to create a situation where they could defend themselves against the Soviet Union, which was a pretty mighty power at the time. And as the Cold War went through, NATO acted together to do what they needed to do to, in their opinion, protect themselves from the encroachment of the Soviet state, right? And look, it's not like the Soviets weren't antagonizing. So at the time, during the Cold War, hunky-dory, right? Everyone was kind of being an asshole. So they acted as defensively as they felt they could at the time. However, since the fall of the Soviet Union, there have been interesting antagonisms from NATO that aren't really talked about. So I don't know if you remember, but I think it was in 2012. I think it was either right as Obama was coming in or right before Obama was coming in, or maybe it was during Obama's term. I'm not remembering the exact year, but we moved missile systems to Poland, and which was a weird move because it kind of, if you remove all the context about Russia antagonism with the West and vice versa, it seems kind of weird to just send military hardware to Poland and missile silos to Poland. And when we did that, Russia saw it as an antagonism. By the way, one of the reasons perhaps that this is happening now is because Putin has been involved with Russian politics pretty much since the collapse of the Soviet Union. So he watched this too, right? So I'm going to get to Russia and their motivations in a second, but I did just want to put that in. So in the early 2010s, we put weapon systems into Poland. We reinforced militarily our allies close to Eastern Europe. And essentially, we took a situation where all guns were pointed to a particular direction, and we just added more guns to that. So we have not exactly been innocent either here in keeping, in keeping the peace and from being a non-antagonistic player in the game of European politics. Okay, so and by the way, there have been accusations from NATO countries that Russia has done these terrible things. Now, some of which we have confirmation for, right? So they did poison politicians. The Kremlin has had people thrown out of buildings. A poisoned journalist did show, a poisoned ex-spy did show up in a British hospital, right? There are things that Russia actually has done which are very bad. But there have been accusations that Russia is meddling in the elections of its neighbors and things like that. By the way, things that the United States does all the time, but, very much pointing the finger at Russia and saying you're bad because you do these things. It's not whataboutism, it's just the truth. So we're looking at the United States, we're looking at the NATO incentives here. Now let's move on to the United States as kind of separate from NATO and what our incentives are, right? So it's difficult to assess exactly what the United States is looking to do in here, but while it is true that lots of American bureaucrats were also and elected officials were also bureaucrats and elected officials during the Cold War, and many of them just see the world that way still, right? They see Russia as the big bad enemy, and they see America as the shining city on a hill. And by the way, we saw this attitude reflected during the 2012, 2016, and 2020 elections, where there were accusations of Russian disinformation or Russians hacking the voting machines and things like that, right? So the media and the politicians have played a big game in antagonizing Russia verbally, right? So if you take these together, right, just giving you context, okay. And another thing is, America is looking, so we have a ton of resource reserves, right? And we are constantly trying to pawn those resources off to other nations, right? Sell them, make profit, and things like that. And we see Russia's providing of gas, natural gas, and oil to Europe as competition with us, right? Because we sell to Europe as well. And Russia, they can send their oil to Europe for cheaper because they just have a pipeline. They can just deliver it over land, right? Whereas we have to take our oil by sea. Okay, so there's some of the US's motivations and kind of how we've been playing this game for a while. Now let's move to Russia. So Russia has an interesting and long history with the West. I detailed it on on a previous episode of the show, but more or less, there has been this constant conflict about how Russia uses and shares its resources with Europe, and Europe holding back technology and development aid and trade and things to Russia. So it's been a constant antagonism for centuries. None of this is particularly new, okay? So back in the day, it was wood and coal. Nowadays, it's gas and oil. So last time I checked, Russia provided about 40% of Europe's oil and gas, which is a significant amount. And Russia has used that in the past to get what it wants. So oftentimes, there have been situations in Europe where Russia didn't like something that was happening in the European Union, or they didn't like something that was happening vis-a-vis NATO. And they threatened and occasionally did turn off the spigot at Russia and said, hey, you know what? You don't want to behave the way that we want you to behave. We're just going to stop providing you with oil and gas. Now, if you're a country that relies on Russia for oil and gas, and 40% of all of your oil product, by the way, that's an aggregate for Europe. I'm sure per country it fluctuates, but let's just say 40, right, as an average. If you're Germany and 40% of your oil and gas supply vanishes and the demand stays the same, you all know how capitalism works, the price shoots through the moon. So, and of course, that causes problems at home because the German citizenry then get very upset that gas prices are a gazillion euros. So Russia has used this to their advantage because they've felt that, there's some injustice or what have you. Is it justified? Maybe, but the thing is, it was at least a non-militaristic way to decide, to have conflict and conflict resolution in Europe. Sorry, I was just kind of struggling for what the right word there was going to be. And one of the other things that Russia has done is that Russia has kind of played out these small kind of pokes in the red line of Europe, which has not been explicit, but is kind of like, hey, we don't really do the whole conquering nations thing anymore. We kind of gave that up in the 1900s after colonialism. So Russia has kind of tested the limits of what the West will let them do with their wars in Chechnya, with their intervention in Northern Asia, in how they have dealt with former Soviet bloc countries. It's just kind of easier to do them that way. So, so Russia has been kind of seeing where they can get away with doing aggressive acts. And for what I think is good reason, the West hasn't really responded too harshly. I mean, there's occasionally been sanctions and things, but there hasn't been a ton of pushback there. So Russia in some way feels emboldened to do these bad things because they're not really getting a ton of pressure back, right, from them. So let's look deeper into Russia's motivation. So actually, I want to take a moment and go back in Russian history. So one of the key drivers of Russian aggression, expansion, and imperialism over time since 900 whatever, when Muscovian Rus was founded, has been the seeking of a warm water port. Russia has always been a land with plentiful resources, but the problem has always been finding a way to trade them that isn't over land, because oftentimes Russia has been surrounded by aggressive neighbors, and they've wanted to trade to build their economy up by trading with other people. And the issue has always been for Russia that while they have access to lots of bodies of water, until very recently, those bodies of water would freeze up for 9 months out of the year. And if you can only use a port for 1 to 3 months out of the year, it's not really a useful port for you, and the revenue that you get from it isn't particularly helpful either, right? So you get to the point where Russia is looking constantly for a way to find at least one port that they can use every day of the year, or at least most days of the year, because this would allow them to create a lot of economic development and modernization and things of that nature, right? Now, once we moved into the world of air travel, things changed a little bit, right? You can trade goods in other ways, but some goods don't fly, right? Natural resources, kind of basic materials, basic resources, they don't really fly particularly well, right? No one's flying lumber as a trade resource, right? They're heavy, they would weigh down planes, right? So you need ships and trucks to do it. So this kind of brings Russia to this point. Now with the oil and gas, they were able to create pipelines, and the more pipelines they can create, the more gas they can pump out, the more trading they can do, the more development money they can have, right? So there was some alleviation of this issue with pipelines. Now, you've probably heard of Nord Stream 2, which has now been canceled. The United States, they claim because of the incursion into Ukraine, they're canceling the Nord Stream pipeline or putting pressure on Germany to cancel the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, which would pump oil and gas directly from Russia to Germany. And by the way, that's a perfectly good reason to get rid of the pipeline, right? But as I mentioned before, the United States also has an interest there, right? So we're not being totally, putting our cards on the table when we tell Germany to close a Nord Stream 2 pipeline, because America also benefits from that, right? Because if they don't sell them the oil, who's going to sell them the oil? The US and US allies, right? So there is some gain there for the US as well. So bringing it back to the present age, the thing that's kind of interesting about the Ukraine conflict is that it doesn't really map with Russia's traditional MO. For conflict and expansion, because Ukraine doesn't really have any warm water ports either. And where they do are those separatist regions in Crimea that Russia has kind of sort of already aligned themselves with. And by the way, the Ukraine wasn't going to go in and retake those independent regions. So Russia kind of had the access it needed. So this is kind of out of the traditional scope of what Russian expansionism looks like. So then the next question becomes, what is the motivation? Well, as I mentioned earlier, Vladimir Putin has been a part of the Russian state politics since the collapse of the Soviet Union, and he very much has ambitions to put a lot of that back together. He feels as if he feels as if that the areas that are now post-Soviet territories were properly Russian, and should be brought back under the Russian fold. That's a possible motivation. One of the other motivations that Russia's had throughout history, because of its antagonistic relationship with the West, is they want the Russian motherland to have a border, a barrier between them and the West. And in this case, before Ukraine was talking about joining NATO, Ukraine was actually a great buffer zone because it was going to be difficult for European nations to kind of wage a conflict at Russia with Ukraine in the way. Now, in some sense, invading Ukraine actually nullifies this. It's a little confusing because if you take over Ukraine, then Ukraine becomes Russia, and then there's no barrier between Russia and Europe. But this is the same thing that happened during the Russian Revolution, not the Russian Revolution, sorry, during the Russian imperial period, where essentially those nations, those post-Soviet, what we now call post-Soviet nations, were the Pale of Settlement region of the Russian Empire and essentially existed as a buffer between the West and Russia. And by the way, continued to do so as part of the Soviet territories up through World War II. And just kind of an interesting factoid of history there, that's where the Russian state had kind of put all the Jews to be the buffer between, hey, if they're going to invade, at least they kill the Jews first, right? So anyway, that's ancient history. It's not ancient history, but it's history, and I'm not considering it in my analysis here. So the motivations kind of seemingly lead back to either one of two factors. One, Putin is a Soviet man. He believes very much in Russian hegemony and Russian imperialism and wants to see the empire, as it were, or the socialist republics, although I'm sure he wouldn't go for a socialist model, restored as they were under the Soviet Union or the Russian Empire. So I think there's some of that's involved, but also to create some non-neutral territory that is an actual buffer between the Russian motherland, the Russian state, as it's understood on most modern maps, and the West, right, who Putin, rightly or wrongly, mostly rightly, sees as antagonistic to Russian interests, right? But is that a reason to invade a country? No, it's not, right? There are diplomatic ways to create these buffer zones. And actually, Volodymyr Zelensky had said that we're not actually, we want to be part of NATO, but maybe that's a pipe dream, right? Maybe in this current political climate, it's not possible. And so we just don't become part of NATO. And so it was on the table for Zelensky to actually not be part of NATO. So you'd think that part of the reason that Russia would have had to invade had gone away. So I really do think this kind of comes back to the ramblings of a mad Putin here. I also think that there are some economic reasons for this, and I also think that there are buffer zone reasons for this. I think Putin sees having buffer nations there as an important part of the Russian security against Europe, who Russia sees as its primary antagonizer. And I also think Russia sees itself as fairly safe from economic retribution from the West because China, who is a close ally of Russia, has essentially, played their hand as neutrally as possible, but are going to continue providing the Russian state with economic relief and goods and things. So where does that leave us? So essentially, we end up in a situation where what we have going on today is happening. It's hard to tell exactly why. It's hard to tell exactly where the battle lines are, but we are in a terrible situation now because there's a hot war going on. Like, we're no longer trading pithy barbs and things. There's an actual hot war. People are dying. Explosions are going off. And so what do we do about that? So the Biden administration has started moving to put sanctions on Russia, has ended the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. As I mentioned, that's not entirely for selfless reasons. But these sanctions have to be very careful because sanctions in general are, as I've discussed on the show in the past, are actually a very dangerous way to enact warfare and can be, in some situations, as violent or more violent as war itself. Right, like the sanctions the U.S. is putting on Afghanistan are perhaps more violent than the war itself was. But if you sanction the bank accounts of specific Russian oligarchs, you sanction the money that the military uses, you can put pressure on the Russian state that doesn't lead necessarily to a hot war. Now, look, once this starts going on, and look, if Putin starts to feel this can go one of two ways. Either Russia amps up its aggression and essentially uses the sanctions as a pretext for a more disastrous war front, where there is a seizing of resources, there's a destroying of property for the benefit of the Russian state because of the sanctions, or Putin reaches out and attacks other countries as a way of recouping some of the losses from the sanctions, or, which is the hawk approach, or Putin takes the dove approach and says, you know what, it's too much. It's too much on me personally. It's too much on the billionaires that support me. We're going to back out and we're going to sue for peace, right? So there's two ways it can go. Truthfully, I don't know which way it's going to go, but I think they're going to have to be much harsher sanctions. Now, asterisk, right? Again, these sanctions need to be equally pinpointed as the last ones are, but they probably need to be much harsher before you convince the Russian state to stop moving. Now, there's one more thing I wanted to talk about, just kind of a last point to round off this conversation. One of the interesting points that's just kind of being reported as if there's nothing fishy with it is that, one, the speech that Putin gave, that was released, that Putin had given about recognizing Luhansk and Donetsk as independent countries, apparently came after Duma approval. So for those of you who don't know, the Duma is the parliament of Russia. And for those of you who really don't know, the Duma is a rubber stamp for Putin and has been for a very long time. Now, it wasn't always this way, but the Duma actually, even in Russian history, has not been a particularly great independent check. During the time of the monarchy, the Duma was pretty much a rubber stamp for what the monarchy wanted to do. And if they weren't a rubber stamp for what the monarchy wanted to do, the monarchy did what it wanted anyway, because they were a monarchy. So it was difficult for the Duma to ask an independent check. During the Soviet era, forget about it. The party really ran things. The Duma was definitely a rubber stamp if they were involved at all. And in the modern sense, there was some hope, right, in 92 that the Duma was going to be an actual check. It was going to be on the power of the executive. It was going to essentially be like Congress is, making sure, writing laws and passing laws, and hopefully more effective than our Congress, but you get the idea, right? Like any legislature would do. However, Putin used his gravitas to essentially manipulate his way to where he is, and then use his political acumen to weasel out anyone, to use the power of the state and his political acumen to force out any politician that wasn't in line with his will. So when Putin sent his, hey, I want to invade Ukraine to the Duma essentially, they said, well, how high, right? I mean, there was really never going to be any amount of challenge to Putin from the Duma in this particular case. So you'll hear a lot of people reporting that the Duma signed off on this. I wouldn't give any weight to that. The Duma is essentially a rubber stamp for whatever the Russian executive wants to do, and it has been very much like that for centuries. So yeah, so that's just the last piece of information I wanted to give. So hopefully, look, I don't have the answers. I hurt very badly for those people in Russia and Ukraine who are suffering right now. I kind of saw this coming when, we heard that Luhansk and Donetsk were evacuating civilians to Russia. When you see something like that, you just think to yourself, they know something that we don't know, right? And that something that we don't know was actually something we all kind of knew, which was, hey, war's coming, and it's coming pretty fast. So yeah, it's really tragic all around. It's very upsetting, this whole situation. I hope for peace. I hope that there are, that there are economic impositions made on the Russian leadership, not the Russian people. And I hope that as few people die in this stupid, meaningless, egotistical conflict as possible. And I hope that as you continue to think about what your opinion on this war is, and who the good guys and bad guys are, if you even care to use that language, and truly I don't. You consider the information that I provided you here, that you're not necessarily hearing from a lot of other outlets and resources talking about this. So hopefully I was able to provide some context for you as you formulate your opinions on the war, and as you to have these discussions with people in your life. And God bless Ukraine. God bless the Ukrainian people. I mean, states are they are what they are, but God bless the Ukrainian people. Hopefully, they are in a position where they are safe, and yeah, it's really rough, and I feel really bad for what's going on right now. I wish it wasn't.
Thanks for watching this video, guys. If you liked it, throw a like on it, share with your friends, and subscribe for more of our content. You can also find all of our videos and clips on youtube.com. Just search Let Them Eat Bread and you'll find all of our content. Alright guys, see you next time. Bye for now.